Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar, back at our usual day and time. Sorry, West Coast members, I think we're going to stick with noon. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. We have a very large audience today. I know, I think I say that every week, but in fact, today we do. We have a terrific audience. So I am going to introduce the JPC and then our speaker, and then we will go. If you've heard the JPC introduction before, hear it again. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization established in 1985, providing analysis of foreign and domestic policy by leading scholars and academics. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them, and the security of the Jewish people everywhere, including when they fly on Lufthansa. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. You can read our publications, insight articles, the In-Context blog, Alliance Tracker, and Frontline Defense, and our magazine In Focus Quarterly on our website, which is jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. You can also see there the previous webinars and see who's been talking to us and what they have to say. We have a lot of good information up there and a lot of excellent and enlightening speakers. Speaking of enlightening speakers, I am thrilled to have Jonathan Schanzer as our guest today. He is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he is also on the leadership team for FDD's Center for Economic and Financial Power. John previously worked as a terrorism finance expert for the Department of the Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He spent time at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and at Middle East Forum, and he sat in my chair here at the Jewish Policy Center. John, I hope I'm living up to the standard that you set for us. He is the author of a terrific new book, Gaza 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. You can read the reviews in the spring issue of In Focus, or you can read the reviews and then buy the book. I recommend that you read the review and then buy the book. His previous books have been very, very important and useful contributions to the conversation about the Middle East as well. One was State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State, in which he argues that the reason there is no Palestinian state is the Palestinian Authority. I don't know anybody who would argue with that. He wrote Hamas and Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine, in which he analyzes the Palestinian Civil War, begun in 2007 and ongoing. And he wrote Al-Qaeda's Armies, Middle East Affiliate Groups, and the Next Generation of Terror. He's written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, along with more than a dozen monographs and chapters for edited volumes. He testifies frequently before Congress, and he is on the American and international media. In the States, he's done Fox News and CNN. In Arabic, he's done Arabic language channels. He's done Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera. I'm not sure I do that second one too often anymore. He is a sought-after public speaker everywhere in the Middle East, from Kuwait to Israel to Egypt to the Palestinian territories and on. His PhD is from King's College in London, where he wrote his dissertation on US Congress and its efforts to combat terrorism. Maybe he'll give us an update, tell us how we're doing. Today, he is going to talk about the recent and ongoing violence against Israel, ginned up by the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Iran. Is it the same as the 2021 rocket war? Is it different? What does that do to Israel's responses? And I'm pretty sure he's going to get to the death of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, which is something to be mourned, absolutely and certainly, but also something to be understood. John Schanzer, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Shoshana. Great to be with everybody today. I certainly had not prepared initially to talk about Shireen Abu Akleh, but let me do that now. I'll start with that and then get to the sort of meat and potatoes of the discussion that we had planned for today. So first, let me just say this, that it is undeniably a tragedy. We are always concerned about the welfare of journalists operating in war zones, and it's no different in the West Bank or in Israel or in the Gaza Strip, for that matter. And so I think that we should be treating this seriously. This should not be dismissed out of hand. That all said, I just note a couple of things which I actually flagged on Twitter last night, but I think useful to review. One is that this death took place amidst a firefight, and by all accounts, this was a firefight in the town of Jenin between what appear to be either Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas, or perhaps gunmen from both factions, in a battle with the IDF. This was chaotic, to put it mildly, and the idea that this was intentional in some way is really what is bothering me. If there was an exchange of fire that was going on and ultimately a journalist was struck down as a result of it, this is just a tragic outcome from someone who was trying to cover the conflict as we know it. But to blame Israel for deliberately murdering this journalist, I think, is out of bounds. And regardless of whose bullet actually struck the journalist, it is, I think, unfair, to put it mildly, to ascribe intent here. So that I think is number one. Two, we should be seeing an investigation into this. Israel should welcome it. I think Israel has welcomed it. The question now is whether the Palestinian Authority will want to engage. From everything that we've seen right now, the answer is no. Right now, we're hearing from Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, that he wants to take this to the International Criminal Court, wants to bypass a negotiation, or rather an investigation with Israel, and he's not even negotiating the terms of this, which I think is highly problematic, and also obviously raises questions about chain of custody for the bullet itself, to be able to ascertain the ballistics here and make a determination. I mean, who knows what bullet they want to send to the ICC at this point. If the Israelis can't get a glimpse of what's going on, it will be tainted. And I think that's probably the goal. I think the goal here is to turn this into some kind of a weapon, a bludgeon against Israel. And it's a shame that is what's going on. Number three, Jenin. The town of Jenin for the last 20 years has been a security nightmare. It's been a security nightmare for Israel, but it's also been a security nightmare for the Palestinian Authority. It's been a hotbed of Hamas activity. This should be a wake-up call that the Palestinian Authority needs to reassert itself, and to perhaps do so with the help of Israel. And of course, it is only with the help of Israel that they would be able to do this. The security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel is extremely well known, and the idea that somehow we can ignore this hotbed of Hamas activity for much longer, I think it's wishful thinking. I think that if we're not careful, Hamas could potentially even conquer swaths of the West Bank. This is a nightmare scenario for all involved: Israel, the Palestinians, Jordan, the United States. This is something that we need to tackle soon, and I think that that should be a message. Four is I'll just note here that Al Jazeera is at the center of this controversy. And it's not the first time that Al Jazeera has been at the center of a controversy as it relates to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. If you read my book, you'll know that there's a chapter where we look at the Al Jazeera office that was in the Al Jala Tower, which Israel destroyed during the war of last May. That office that Al Jazeera had maintained was housed in the same building as a electronic warfare outfit, is probably the best way of putting it, where Hamas was openly trying to jam Iron Dome so that more rockets would enter into Israel and cause damage. This is something that I would be shocked if Al Jazeera was not aware of in some shape or form. Also, remember here that Al Jazeera is owned by the Qataris, and the Qataris are, of course, financial sponsors of Hamas. And it's one of those things where I think, the Al Jazeera television network has been promoting libels against Israel for as long as it has been around. It is a tool of the Qatari government to whip up anti-Israel sentiment, to promote pro-Hamas sentiment, without having all the facts right now. If Al Jazeera pushes on this narrative that Israel or the IDF had deliberately murdered a journalist. I believe that we're really looking at something that is far more problematic, and we should be looking. I think, in fact, really, Al Jazeera should be identified as a state media outlet on social media. I think people should be warned, much in the way that we see, for example, on Twitter, that an outlet or a feed is Chinese government owned or Russia government owned. I believe that Al Jazeera deserves a similar designation on social media in light of all of this. But I would just say that Al Jazeera needs to be extremely careful right now with the allegations that it makes, especially with its journalist at the center of this. And then the last thing that I'll just note before we get to the rest of the conversation today is that this is the latest in a long list of tragic episodes in which Israel is blamed first before the facts are found. And there are some of these that continue to be live debates even today. I'm thinking right now in particular about the Mohammed al-Dora episode from the year 2000, where a young kid was killed in the crossfire in the early days of the Second Intifada. It took months, if not years, to ultimately determine that it was likely a Palestinian gunman, not an Israeli gunman, that killed this young boy. But nevertheless, the damage was done. In fact, I would argue that the Mohammed al-Dora episode gave legs to the Second Intifada and probably fanned the flames of it at a time when perhaps it could have been dialed back and violence could have been curbed. But we see things dating back even to the 1948 War of Independence, the discussions about Deir Yassin and alleged Israeli massacres even back then. And historians have gone back and looked at the facts and have determined that it was, not what it was initially described, but yet it is still seen as one of Israel's original sins. There is a constant effort on the part of the Palestinians, and by the way, not just the radical factions that I think we all would expect, but even among mainstream Palestinian factions, the Palestinian Authority, where the goal is to use episodes like this to bludgeon Israel, and we're seeing that now. So let's hope that the IDF is able to get a handle on the ballistics. Let's hope for a joint investigation, but if not, I would say prepare for a long battle about what happened to Shireen Abu Akleh, and that's just an unfortunate reality of the conflict as we know it. So with that, let me move to the violence that we're seeing in Israel and what it all means. So first, let's just talk about the sort of scene setter. Tensions have been running high. Some of that has had to do with the month of Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, which, by the way, I should just note is typically a month of introspection and family and enlightenment. But in recent years, it has become an excuse for violence, and we saw that in places like Iraq. At the height of the Iraq War, where Ramadan was a month where our American soldiers came under attack. In the last couple of years, we've seen heightened tension in Jerusalem in particular. But we could look at that. We could look at Jerusalem Day. We could look at Israeli Independence Day, otherwise known as Nakba Day in Palestinian circles, as moments that could be stoking tension. There also is an ongoing real estate dispute in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem. The Palestinian economy is struggling. The West Bank continues to look weak vis-a-vis Israel and Hamas. These were all circumstances that I just mentioned just now that purportedly led to the war last May that lasted for 11 days, that embroiled the region in violence, that led to Hamas firing 4,000 rockets into Israel. And yet war is not erupting now. We see terrorist attacks. We see Hamas calling for more attacks. But what we're not seeing is rockets that are being fired out of Gaza into Israel in the way that we did last year. All of the things that I mentioned, the tensions relating to Ramadan and to Israeli Independence Day and Jerusalem Day, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, the economy in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip still struggling, COVID-19, all of these things were there last year and they're here this year, except last year there was a war. Right now, up until now, there's not been. So the question is why? What are the differences? How can we explain the lack of violence. Okay, let's try to unpack this. One, the elections, the Palestinian elections that were scheduled for April last year. I talk about this in my book, and I'll talk about it again. There was a decision taken by the Palestinians after the Abraham Accords were entered into in September of 2020. It was at that moment that the Palestinians realized that they needed to put their house in order, that the internecine Palestinian conflict that erupted in 2006 and 2007 had been a black mark on the Palestinian political identity, if you will, that ultimately, I think, led all sides, Hamas, Fatah, and others, to say, look, we need to have elections. We need to have a singular representative. We need to begin to claw back the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people, as well as the Arab world. Then with a few weeks left until those elections were set to be held, Mahmoud Abbas, under some pressure from the pragmatic Arab states, as well as from the United States and Israel, ultimately decided to cancel those elections. That's what set Hamas off. I cannot stress this enough, that it was almost certainly that issue alone, that prompted Hamas to want to reclaim the mantle of Palestinian leadership. They were blocked from taking part in the political process. So what does a terrorist group do when it cannot engage in politics? They engage in violence. This almost certainly explains what happened last year. And right now, you don't see that. You don't see the political dynamic creeping into the discussion among Palestinians right now. Yes, Hamas is still, sequestered in the Gaza Strip, and yes, the West Bank is still struggling economically and politically, but the competition is not as acute, and I think it's for that reason that we're seeing more calm. That's one. Number two, Hamas is rebuilding. It cannot afford another conflict the way that it did last year. Israel destroyed much of Hamas's infrastructure, including the Al Jala Tower that I mentioned, the building that housed that economic warfare system that was trying to dismantle Iron Dome. Israel was able to destroy the metro system. This was a labyrinth of tunnels that Hamas had worked for years to create, diverting cement and other building materials in order to prepare for a conflict in which the goal was to try to kidnap or kill as many IDF soldiers as they could in the event of a ground invasion. It's going to take time for Hamas to bring in new weaponry. It's going to take some time for Hamas to replenish the 4,000 rockets that it fired. And by doing that, they're going to have to either work directly with the Iranians to bring in entire missiles, which is a lot harder with the Israelis doing whatever they can to halt that smuggling activity. But generally speaking, look, it takes 2 or 3 years for Hamas to be ready for its next battle. That's the average. And the amount of time between last year's war and the previous war was 7 years, right? It was 2014 to 2021. This was on the long side of things, but it's indicative of what Hamas needs to prepare itself so that it can try to put up a good showing during a conflict with Israel. And that is I would say that should be the benchmark. It's not to say that Hamas, won't decide tomorrow to fire rockets into Israel and to launch a war. But right now they're not. And I believe that a lot of that has to do with the rebuilding, which they're doing with Iran. And I think it's just, really important to stress here that Iran is a significant actor in all of this, and that if Hamas doesn't have Iranian support, well, then that, I think will speak a lot for the timing of the next conflict. Now, why doesn't Iran see the need to do this right now? And I think this is really perhaps the most important question to ask for the purposes of today's discussion. There is, according to senior Israeli officials, this was noted during the most recent conflict last year, but it's also been confirmed to me by some senior Israeli officials that I had an opportunity to meet with back in February when I was last there. There is a headquarters, or a nerve center, some people are calling it, that is based in Lebanon, that it appears to be doing a good job of keeping a low flame of terrorist attacks alive inside Israel. Hezbollah and Hamas both appear to be involved. It's not their center to run, it's Iran's, but they are involved and they're helping. It's not correct, I believe, to say that Hamas is behind these attacks. Sinwar is trying to fan the flames by calling people to action, but that's after the fact in most cases. All right. The attacks that we're seeing were happening long before Sinwar told people to take axes and knives and to go kill as many Israelis as possible. But at the end of the day, Iran, through this nerve center, seems to be able to bring out those independent actors that are engaging in violence. Some of these acts of violence have been attributed to the Islamic State. Some have been attributed to lone wolves. But the fact is that if they're getting some assistance or coordination out of this nerve center, I think it is incredibly significant. And again, Israeli officials have indicated that this center is active, that it is something that Iran is running. Now, I would just note, I joked about this on Twitter and elsewhere. This may be the only functioning institution in Lebanon right now. As the government is falling apart, the economy is collapsing. It's remarkable that there's even something that would be functioning at this level. But nevertheless, it is something to watch right now. But if they are sufficiently keeping Israel on its back foot through the coordination of this irregular warfare, this asymmetric spate of attacks, then they don't need an all-out war with Israel, which would deplete Hamas's resources and potentially cause harm to one of its more valued proxies. So that's 3. Number 4, Turkey is not fanning the flames of this conflict right now, like it was last year. It's still not a helpful actor, and we're hearing that Saleh Haruri, who is one of Hamas's top military figures, is still shuttling back and forth between Istanbul and Lebanon, where this nerve center is based. His goal is to continue to fan the flames of the low-level violence, but also to construct military installations for a multi-front war. That's all very troubling, but we're hearing it, at least for now, that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, is trying or is working to remove some of the Hamas presence in an effort to get back into the good graces of the United States and the NATO alliance amidst the pressure that he is feeling with his neighbor, Russia, invading Ukraine. That he now sees that all of the anti-Israel activity and the pro-Hamas activity and pro-jihadi activity may not be paying the dividends that he's looking for. And by the way, Turkey is also going through a massive economic crisis of its own, massive inflation and things like that. So I would say that the lack of inflammatory remarks coming out of Turkey, coming out of Erdogan, may also have something to do with that absence of war. And that leads me to 5, and that is that even Qatar may be a little bit more tentative. This is, of course, another financial patron, political patron of Hamas. It's got this new role, unbelievably, shockingly, really disgustingly. It's been named as the major non-NATO ally by the Biden administration. This is, of course, a state sponsor of terrorism in all but name that has been behind, the activities of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas and others. They just actually, there was a leadership summit between Iran and Qatar just yesterday. But look, at the end of the day, they are more quiet on this issue, although that could change now that this this killing of Shireen Abu Nakhleh is being described as a murder. That if that continues to be something that we hear and that Al Jazeera continues to embrace, we may see a change here on the part of the Qataris that could lead to an escalation. And again, we're hoping that it won't. The last thing that I'll just say in terms of reasons for what's going on or the lack of violence is that Hamas is somewhat homeless right now. It has this small base that it's trying to build out in Lebanon. It's got its traditional base in Qatar, but they've been more quiet there, politically speaking. In Turkey, as I mentioned, they've got less of a hospitable base from which to operate, and so this is prompting the organization more broadly to look for new bases. And we're actually seeing the occasional story right now about Hamas is looking for a new home. Interestingly, Malaysia has popped up as a possible base of operations. I've heard from Israelis that this could be the best of all options to get them out of the Middle East, to have their base be in a far-flung place. As we know, by the way, though, that won't stop the Israelis from targeting Hamas. They have actually engaged in targeted assassinations in Malaysia, assassinations that have been credited to the Mossad, and it's been really interesting to see what's been going on there. It's been primarily students and engineers developing new weapons over there, but this would not be the worst thing in the world. But generally speaking, we're seeing that tentative approach by Hamas right now, potentially because they're in that state of flux. And this was, by the way, the case after the falling out that Hamas had with Iran and Syria back in 2013. And if you recall, I mentioned earlier, that was the greatest gap. There was that war in 2014. And then there was 7 years while Hamas was trying to resettle itself. There were 7 years without a major war. It could be that that sense of homelessness, that lack of a solid base, could be influencing Hamas to hold back a bit. Now, again, all these things are reasons that we could, use to explain why things are not happening. But things could happen very quickly. They could change overnight, and that is something that, of course, that we're watching. Now, the question then is, what's next? I would say number one is that the low-level attacks that we're seeing, this asymmetric kind of shadow conflict with independent actors, people claiming to be part of the Islamic State or other lesser-known groups, this could be the new normal, unfortunately, for Israel. That ongoing attacks, possibly coordinated out of Beirut, out of this nerve center, this could be kind of a low-level uprising, not an intifada. Not even, we saw in the past car ramming intifadas or knife intifadas, where these are small, kind of low-level campaigns that last for a time. It was hard for Israel to stop this activity. I think it's still hard for Israel to stop this activity. We're hearing that there are they're coming up with kind of a new force that is designed to promote or actually to organize rather border security. And it's Mishmar Hagvul, as it's called, where it's internal security services that are associated with the IDF, not with the police itself. So a supplemental force that may be deployed on a more regular basis to prevent those kinds of attacks, but they don't really prevent. What they're there is to be able to address an attack quickly after you hear gunshots or after authorities are called. To prevent, I would say, more violence, right? It will be designed to hopefully cut down an attacker early on in an attack versus being able to prevent it, because prevention is not an easy thing to do when you're talking about asymmetric violence along the lines, this kind of one-off lone wolf type of attacks. So that's one. And the other thing that people have been talking about is a popular uprising. Could we see another intifada? And in here, and I talk about this in my book from last year as well, this is really hard to replicate. There was one intifada that began in the late 1980s. That was the first intifada. It truly was an organic uprising, a natural outgrowth, an explosive expression of Palestinian nationalism. In my view, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event. And it ultimately led to Oslo, and Oslo ultimately became a process where Palestinian nationalism was given a fair shake, and then ultimately the leadership of the Palestinians, precisely speaking, Yasser Arafat, rejected that process, and it led to the collapse of the Palestinian national movement as we know it. And I don't think it's been rebuilt, and I think there is a sense of exhaustion, of exasperation, and I'm not sure that we will see it. I just don't think we'll see something like that return. It's not impossible, but the stars need to align. It's extremely hard to predict, but I'll just say that even during the Arab Spring, right, 2011 through 2016, there was that 5-year period where we were seeing these uprisings all across the Arab world, and it was kind of a moment to the Palestinians where they said, the message was, you can have an uprising too, and it could have been against Israel, it could have been against Mahmoud Abbas, it could have been just against both for that matter. It didn't happen. And I would say that was the window that I would have expected a resurgence of that intifada activity. I haven't seen it. So I'd say keep an eye out for it. If this does seem like it's more organic. And by the way, the tragic death of Shireen Abu Akleh again could be the kind of thing that could spur on these kinds of protests. It's possible. And certainly we've seen some of them in small numbers inside the Palestinian territories and even in Arab towns inside Israel. But I don't see it happening in the way that I think some in the Palestinian realm might hope. And then finally, there's that question of war, and then getting back to the question of whether Hamas is ready, whether they've resupplied, whether they've got the new weapons that they want from Iran, whether they've rebuilt the things that were destroyed during the last war, whether they've prepared another labyrinth of tunnels, or whatever the other surprises are. It generally takes more than a year. It generally does. So I don't want to rule out war. I think that it's certainly still possible, but I think it's less likely given what we've seen in the past, if we're going to use the past as a guide. So option 3 sounds bad, but unlikely. But the other thing that I'll just say here is when we talk about war, we constantly talk about these conflicts when they erupt as something that has a beginning and an end. In my view, this was probably the only real mistake that I found, although my 13-year-old son did find one typo in my book. And there's a prize for anybody else who finds it, because no one else has since. So that might be a motivator for you to go out and buy the book if you haven't yet. But the big mistake that I would say about my book and the way that it was constructed, as I look back, is I made it seem like this Gaza war from 2021 had a beginning and an end. In fact, it is the extension of a war that has been going on, if not since 1948 or since 67 or since, whenever, but certainly we could say that since the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip, and that was in 2007, we have had steady barrages that we could witness coming out of the Gaza Strip into Israel. There's incendiary balloons, there's attacks at the border. These things have been going on at a steady cadence for the last 14 years. It has been one long war. Sometimes we see it tick up in its intensity. Sometimes we see it turn back down. But the fact remains is that this has been one long slog for Israel, and it's been a long slog for the people of Gaza. And it has been waged at the hands of Hamas with assistance from Iran, with assistance from Hezbollah, with assistance from other Shiite militia actors around the region, and then certainly also Qatar, Turkey, Malaysia. So it's one long war. I think it's important to remember that, and that what we're seeing inside Israel, I think, is going to be attributed in part to that long war. So what am I watching for now? I'm watching for the cycle that we see out of the Gaza Strip. That cycle is basically, it can be described easily. First, it's the replenishment of weapons. And that is usually followed or even done in tandem with target banking, which is something that Israel is doing as we speak. That as Hamas rebuilds and as it begins to place in Gaza new assets that will be used to attack Israel, the Israelis are getting legal approval now from their Ministry of Justice and from the lawyers in the IDF to attack those targets if and when conflict erupts. And that's happening constantly, with the Shin Bet usually taking the lead inside the Gaza Strip, but also the IDF. Then once that process is firmly underway, and I think we're reaching a moment of maturity there on both, maybe another year or two, but that's when you're going to begin to see the real testing of red lines. It could happen tomorrow. Again, I'll just be very blunt. Hamas may just decide, you know what, the heck with it, we're going to launch another war. But generally speaking, they wait till they've got that replenished rocket arsenal and other weapons, and then they start testing Israel's red lines with the occasional rocket fired into Sderot or into Ashkelon or what have you, and they wait to see, because Israel doesn't want a war in the Gaza Strip. It's actually the last thing that Israel needs. It's a tactical nuisance, not a strategic matter for Israel, but nonetheless, Hamas will be doing that. They'll be testing those red lines. Israel will try to keep quiet in Gaza, and then when the rockets begin to fire into places that Israel deems to be more sensitive, we're talking about the coastal plain, the Gush Dan area, as it's known, the Tel Aviv and its environs, or into Jerusalem, that's when you'll start to see Israel respond, and then the cycle begins anew. But this is all part of that longer trajectory that I think we all have to remember, that that's happening. The attacks that are happening inside Israel are, they're going to likely continue if this nerve center remains a factor, but that will be very distinct from the war scenario that happened last year, and that will almost certainly happen again. The last thing that I'll just note to conclude here is that Israel would like to forestall this all as much as possible. There is a focus on basically two things in Israel more than anything else. All of this other stuff, the Shireen Abu Nakla issue, the attacks inside Israel, horrific as they are a tactical annoyance for Israel, and obviously a tragedy for the families affected. But what they really want to be focusing on are two things: the precision guided munitions that are being amassed right now inside of Lebanon. And I'll just say here, I've talked about this for the JPC. I've talked about it until I've been purple in the face. The Hezbollah organization is now able to produce, according to reports that I've heard, roughly 1 to 1.5 new precision guided munitions per day. This means that the few hundred that we heard about a year ago or 2 years ago is probably now into the mid hundreds, 400, 500, 600. That's a major concern, and that could be pushing Israel to need to act sooner in Lebanon. So that's one reason to not deal with Hamas, or even to deal more seriously with some of the challenges that we're seeing inside Israel proper. And then, of course, the other issue is Iran. And Iran remains the foremost strategic, existential issue that Israel must contend with. And I think suffice it to say, Israel would rather not be dealing with any of what's happening in the Gaza Strip or inside Israel proper right now. And that's exactly why I believe Iran is trying to stoke this. So let's keep an eye out for that nerve center, as it's being called. Hopefully the Israelis will give us a little bit more information on that as details are declassified. Right now, they've been pretty tight-lipped. So I'll end there. I want to thank you, Shoshana, for having me. Hopefully this has been clear enough with all of the holes that we're missing with the various scenarios. But I think this pretty much sums up my thinking right now about what we're seeing out of Israel.
Jonathan, thank you. It's enlightening, it's important, and it's depressing. And I should not thank you for depressing us, but I have a couple of questions, and I'm kind of folding things together that people have asked me here. And one of the questions is, you point to this as an ongoing series of things. It's a kind of rumbling that periodically blows up into something else. How do you think this rumbling on a constant level, exacerbated by the fact that Iran is smuggling weapons and other things into Israel, does it undermine Israeli Arab acceptance of Jewish sovereignty the longer it continues? Israeli Arabs have been a, by and large, rather loyal part of the population of Israel. Is this going to affect them in the long term?
Yes and no. On the one hand, I think we are still seeing, generally speaking, good relations between Israel and Israeli Arabs, more integration. The coalition with the Ram party is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it is still holding. And there is, a modus vivendi, which I think is really remarkable when you think about it. We're almost a year into this new government, and there is something to be said for that. So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, I think it's important to note that, that nerve center was believed to be behind at least some of the rioting that we saw took place last year during the May War, in the mixed cities, as they're called, in Lod and in Jerusalem and Yaffo and elsewhere. And so we need to learn more. Again, I'm giving you the only thing that we know is that this nerve center exists, and we know what things have been attributed to it in the past. This is what we're sort of watching now. And, Mike, the questions that remain unanswered to me, a big question anyway, is how much has Iran been able to infiltrate, or Hezbollah or Hamas for that matter, through this nerve center and through whatever they're doing? How much have they been able to infiltrate the Arab Israeli community? And we don't know the answer. I think the concern has been one of the things that has prompted Israel to take more seriously that internal security force that I discussed earlier. They're doing that in preparation for the next round of conflict so that they have people that they can deploy to these cities to be able to prevent the rioting and things like that. The only other thing that I'll just note on this, and this is where, I think if Israel had its act together from a public messaging perspective, we could see, maybe some better messaging, and that is this. It's been reported, and I think it's widely understood now, that Hezbollah and Iran have been smuggling weapons into Israel. You just mentioned it, Shoshana. We've all watched it. And we've also seen, as this has happened, we've seen a rise in the murder rate among the Arab-Israeli community. In other words, the Arab Israelis have been killing one another. The murder rate has actually been rather shocking over the last year or so. I would argue that, you could really point to Iran and Hezbollah for the deaths of a great number of these people that have been killed in this murder spree, that the injection of weapons into these communities it's not led to a significant uptick of attacks against Israel. The death toll is not as high, to be clear. It's not as high as what we're seeing within the Arab community itself. So I think that's an important message to share here right now, that whatever Iran and Hezbollah and others think that they may be doing with the Arab community, they actually appear to be harming that community more directly and perhaps harming Israel less than they thought.
Thank you. Let's look at another aspect of the war. Jerusalem Post had a story last week about how Jordan and the Palestinian Authority have put their heads together because they are worried about Hamas on the Temple Mount and they're worried about Hamas in the West Bank. It is conceivable that Hamas is not ready to attack Israel, and that takes a lot of preparation because that's Israel. How about the West Bank? Do the Jordanians have a point? Does the Palestinian Authority rightly fear a Hamas takeover there?
Look, there is a real cause for concern about Hamas takeover in the West Bank. And it's for that reason that the Israelis continue to work with the Palestinian Authority. The security cooperation has been excellent by all accounts. It's been marked, obviously, by moments of tension along the way. But Israel is the Palestinian Authority's best friend when it comes to the Hamas threat. Israel is also Jordan's best friend when it comes to those threats. Now, what I think is probably worth noting in the Jordanian context here is I think the rhetoric coming out of Jordan, it looks like the king is playing with fire. The prime minister and the foreign minister are all doing the same. They are going after Israel in vitriolic terms for what has been happening on the Temple Mount and what's been happening in general in Jerusalem. They should know more than anyone that Israel has not stoked this, that this was coordinated during Ramadan, that Hamas and others are trying to exploit it. And every time they issue a statement where they excoriate Israel, this doesn't actually, maybe it helps them domestically because they've got 80% of their population plus is Palestinian, so it might resonate on the streets. But what it's doing is it's redounding to the benefit of Hamas and other extremist actors that are trying to show that Israel is somehow, usurping Muslim, holy sites or usurping Muslim territory. And so Hamas gets the, they get the benefit from what Jordan is doing more than Jordan does. And so we're watching that, and I'm just scratching my head wondering, why would you want to do that? It seems like an own goal from Jordan's perspective. And and then we watch them complain right now that Hamas is getting more control over the Temple Mount amidst all of this. And that really is the reason why Jordan needs to have more agency within the Waqf, within the religious establishment in Jerusalem. It's this circular thing where it just seems like they're chasing their tail and they're not getting any real benefit out of it. And I would just note on top of that Jordan's in a bad place. They've got internal squabbles taking place within the royal court, stemming from allegations of the king being involved in corruption and mismanagement of the government of Jordan. You've got COVID-19 problems. You've got refugees out of Syria. You've got electricity challenges and water challenges, economic challenges out the wazoo. There is just nothing good that's happening out of Jordan right now that we're seeing at sort of that top line level. Wouldn't it be smarter of the king, when he comes to meet with Joe Biden, to ask him for more economic assistance, to maybe look for other ways for the U.S. to support Jordan and its stability, not getting into conversations about some other country and the way that it rules a Muslim holy site in concert with the Palestinians and the Jordanians. It's a very bizarre approach that I think the Hashemite kingdom has taken up until now. I hope that they dial it back. I hope that they begin to realize that vitriol is only helping Hamas and other radical actors, perhaps even inside Jordan itself.
So last question, and maybe this is partly in response to what you've just said. We haven't really talked about the Abraham Accords countries and their reaction to the violence. There were some early denunciations of Israel from Gulf states about violence on the Temple Mount. I suspect they saw the video of the Hamas guys with their shoes on inside the mosque, and maybe that toned it down a little bit. Where are they now? Is this big enough to threaten the Abraham Accords, or are they waiting for, I don't know what?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that last year's war was a stress test for the Abraham Accords. I think it really was. I think it posed a real challenge. As Emiratis and Bahrainis and others were watching bombs fall on the Gaza Strip, and the images were jarring and very difficult. You're not seeing some kind of Israeli offensive right now. You're really not, right? I mean, it looks like counterterrorism forces or riot control forces are trying to respond to isolated incidents primarily, right? This does not, the images that are coming across the screen may be disquieting, but they're not the kind of thing that suggest a full-blown crisis. I think that's number one. But I think number two is, I think the Arab states in question truly value their relationship with Israel. You get a sense that things have really actually settled into a good place in terms of trade and intelligence sharing and security cooperation and everything else. And the frustration continues to grow with the Palestinians themselves. I mean, it was that frustration with the Palestinians in the first place, along with the threat of Iran, that brought a number of these countries together with Israel, that they realized that they had more in common than they had differences, and ultimately made that decision. And so after having passed the previous stress test and having solidified these peace agreements over the last several years, I don't see them in jeopardy. I would say that the Jordanian relationship looks more threatened than anything else right now. Certainly not the Egyptian one. The Egyptians are working to try to restore calm, which is what I think their role has become. I don't know if the administration here appreciates that role as much as they should, but the Egyptians, I think, have been doing everything that they can, and not to curry favor with the administration, but rather they want to make sure that their neighborhood is calm, which I think everyone should appreciate. So Jordan, I think we should be concerned about. Egypt, less so, definitely, and not worried about the UAE and Bahrain. Morocco, I just actually saw that there was a resumption of flights, or actually an inauguration of flights between Casablanca and Tel Aviv, and that things seem to be going actually quite well on that front. The only Abraham Accords country that I think raises some question marks, which has nothing to do with what's going on in Israel or Gaza, is Sudan. And that's just, I think, by virtue of the inherent instability there in the post-Omar al-Bashir era, and just the big questions that I think surround Sudan and its future leadership. It just doesn't have bandwidth for engaging with Israel in this way. But I'm not, at this point, I would say that is really a low concern on my list, is about how the UAE or Bahrain or others are engaging with Israel. That seems good. Now, again, that could all change in a heartbeat with another Gaza war that breaks out. But again, we've talked about today why that may not be so likely, not impossible, but may not be the most likely scenario.
So that's a great note, because people who join us every once in a while know that I like to end on an up note. And I think you've given us an up note. There aren't that many coming out right now. So I think you gave us an up note and I appreciate it. And we appreciate also learning from you. You have a wonderful broad perspective that encompasses lots of countries, lots of time, lots of things. And that really helps us to put the problem and the potential solutions into perspective. So thank you, Jonathan Schanzer. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back next week at noon on Thursday with Professor Mark Meyerowitz of the City University of New York Maritime School. And that, again, should be a very interesting thing. So I wish you all a good afternoon. And again, our thanks to Jonathan Schanzer.